The Ghost Fleet, the mysterious force that erased the Bronze Age. Most history advice is lying to you, and that is why your understanding of the past is stuck in a loop of misinformation that feels comfortable but is fundamentally hollow. The narrative we have been fed for centuries suggests that the greatest civilizations of the ancient world were brought to their knees by a ragtag group of hungry refugees known as the Sea Peoples. We are told they were displaced migrants, wandering the Mediterranean in search of food, who somehow managed to accidentally topple every superpower from the Nile to the Euphrates. But this story is not just a mistake. It is a carefully maintained exit from the truth. If you look at the evidence through the lens of strategic warfare and modern systemic failure, you realize that the Bronze Age did not just collapse. It was deleted. The force responsible was not a desperate mob of families and ox carts, but a coordinated, technologically superior elite unit that functioned as a ghost fleet. This force executed a systematic erasure of the worldico's superpowers with such precision that it suggests a level of planning history books are intentionally silent about. To understand what actually happened, you have to stop thinking of the Bronze Age as a primitive era of stone and bronze and start seeing it as a globalized economy much like our own. Imagine a total collapse of the modern internet, the immediate severance of all shipping lanes, and a permanent blackout of every power grid on the planet. The Bronze Age was defined by global trade, complex bureaucracies, and a level of sophistication that should have been impossible to dismantle. Yet, in the span of a single generation, it was all gone. You have probably noticed that modern systems are fragile, but the reality is that the ancients were even more interconnected. When the Ghost Fleet arrived, they did not just attack cities. They attacked the operating system of civilization itself. This brings us to the anatomy of the first strike at Ugarit. The fall of this great trade hub is usually described as a tragedy of bad timing, but the primary sources tell a different story. The letters from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus were not desperate pleas for food. They were intelligence reports describing an unstoppable technology. Amurapi, the last king of Ugarit, wrote about enemy ships that had already burned the countryside. He described a force that appeared out of nowhere, bypassed every known naval defense, and utilized tactics that no Bronze Age military could counter. The ships used by the Ghost Fleet were not standard galleys. They were a specific type of vessel that possessed advanced navigation and tactical coordination, allowing them to strike multiple points simultaneously. This was not a migration. It was a synchronized blitz. The letters found in the ruins of Ugarit were still in the kiln, being baked for delivery, when the city was wiped off the map. This suggests that the destruction was so fast that the administrative heart of the empire could not even process the threat before it was terminated. This failure of underestimating the enemy alone killed the Bronze Age, but the next phase was even more calculated. The destruction of the Hittite Empire, the superpower known as the Hatti, is often blamed on famine or internal civil war. However, the evidence points to a scorched earth policy and information warfare. The Ghost Fleet did not just occupy Hattusa, they erased it. They used tactics that suggest they were not interested in the wealth of the Hittites, but in the total removal of their influence. If you are like most people, you assume that a conquering force wants to take over the land they win. But the Sea Peoples did not stay. They moved with surgical precision, hitting the capital, destroying the archives, and leaving the survivors in a dark age that would last 3 centuries. This is the part of the story that creates tension because we need to know why a superior force would destroy a world and then simply vanish. The Medinet Habu reliefs in Egypt are often cited as the definitive proof that the Sea Peoples were refugees because they show images of carts and families. But these reliefs were Egyptian propaganda meant to hide their own fear of a superior military. Ramses III needed to portray the enemy as a manageable threat to maintain his own authority. If you look closer at the carvings, You see a naval battle where the Egyptian ships are struggling against a force that did not fight like humans, but like a highly drilled unit with weapons that should not have existed. There is data regarding the weaponry and metallurgy of the Sea Peoples that suggests they possessed a technological disparity that made the bronze of the empires look like toys. They were masters of logistics and iron working while the rest of the world was still struggling to maintain the tin trade. This suggests a centralized, hidden origin for the Ghost Fleet. They came from beyond the Aegean, perhaps from a lost northern or Atlantic civilization that had already mastered the systems we are only now beginning to understand. The Sea Peoples were not looking for a home. They were executing a planned reset. Information doesn't spread, but emotion does, and the psychological horror of a civilization that comes only to delete yours, not to replace it, is a haunting reality. They did not want the Hittite throne or the Egyptian granaries. They wanted a blank slate. Why did they leave the pyramids untouched while they leveled every palace in the Levant? This is a gap in our knowledge that haunts archaeology. They chose specific monuments to leave standing, almost as if they were markers for a future they were already planning. The Dark Age that followed the collapse was not a tragedy of human progress. It was a deliberate system reset performed by the Ghost Fleet to clear the path for a new world order. They ended the Bronze Age exactly when the complex systems became too bloated to function. This was not the work of hungry migrants. It was the work of a force that understood human systems better than we do today. They were the founders of the next era, the silent architects of the vacuum. As we look at the ruins of Hattusa and the ashes of Ugarit, we are seeing ourselves reflected on the screen of history. We are seeing what happens when a system becomes so complex that it can be toppled by a single, coordinated disruption. The technology of the Ghost Fleet, their mastery of the seas, and their ability to vanish into the mist of time suggests they were never really gone. They were simply moving to the next phase of the cycle. To understand the Ghost Fleet, you must first understand the world they destroyed. The Late Bronze Age was an era of unprecedented connectivity. The kings of Egypt, Hutti, Assyria, and Babylon referred to each other as brothers. They traded lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from the depths of Europe, and copper from Cyprus. This was a fragile web of interdependence. If one thread snapped, the whole tapestry unraveled. The Ghost Fleet knew exactly which threads to cut. Think of the tin trade as the semiconductor industry of 1200 BC. Without tin, you have no bronze. Without bronze, you have no military. By seizing the shipping lanes of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Sea Peoples effectively executed a hardware lockout on the global superpowers. They did not need to fight every soldier in the Hittite army. They just needed to ensure the army could not replace its weapons. The Bronze Age collapse was a supply chain crisis escalated into a world war. While the great kings were arguing over diplomatic protocol, a new kind of enemy was being forged in the shadows of the periphery. These were not tribesmen. They were a breakaway civilization. The metallurgy of the Sea Peoples has long puzzled scholars. While the rest of the world was perfecting the bronze alloy, the Sea Peoples appeared with longer, stronger swords made of early steel and iron. These Naui-2 swords were not just weapons. They were a technological leap that changed the physics of combat. A bronze sword is heavy and prone to snapping. An iron blade is a surgical instrument of war. When the Ghost Fleet descended on the coastal cities of the Levant, they did not just bring fire. They brought an entirely new paradigm of force. Imagine a division of modern special forces attacking a medieval castle. That is the disparity we are talking about. The intelligence reports from Ugarit are terrifying when read through this lens. Amurapi wrote to the king of Alashia, saying the enemy ships have already arrived, the cities are burned, and my troops are elsewhere. This was a classic decapitation strike. The Ghost Fleet waited until the defensive forces were distracted by famine or border skirmishes. Then they struck the administrative core. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the collapse. At Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, the destruction was so complete that the city was never truly rebuilt. The royal archives were burned with such intensity that the clay tablets were baked into permanent records of their own demise. But here is the unanswered question. If the Sea Peoples were just looking for food and land, why did they burn the food and leave the land? They destroyed the granaries. They slaughtered the livestock. They salted the fields. This is not the behavior of a hungry population. It is the behavior of an army tasked with the total deletion of an existing system. The Ghost Fleet was an audit team sent to close the books on a failing era. They were the architects of the dark. When we look at the Medinet Habu reliefs of Ramses III, we see a frantic effort to regain control of the story. Ramses claims he defeated the Sea Peoples in a massive naval battle in the Delta. He shows them trapped in the shallows, their ships being overturned by Egyptian archers. But historical analysis suggests this battle was at best a stalemate, and at worst, a face-saving fabrication. The Sea Peoples depicted in the reliefs are wearing feathered headdresses and horned helmets, appearing exotic and alien. But look at their coordination. Even in the Egyptian depiction, they are shown fighting in tight formations, using shields and spears with a discipline that contradicts the idea of a wild barbarian horde. They were a hive mind of warriors, operating under a command structure that remains invisible to history. Who was commanding them? Where did they refuel? Where did they repair their ships? The sheer scale of the Ghost Fleet hitting Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, and Egypt within a few years requires a logistical base that simply does not exist on the map of the 1200 BC world. This points toward a hidden origin, a lost center of power that functioned as the aircraft carrier for the ancient world. Some point toward the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Others point toward the mysterious islands of the north. But the most disturbing theory is that they came from a location that had Reed's mastered navigation and heavy industry, while the Mediterranean was still in its infancy. They were the survivors of a previous cycle, returning to ensure the next cycle began according to plan. This is the psychological horror, the feeling that we are being managed. The Sea Peoples did not stay to rule because their mission was not to lead, but to clear. They were the cleanup crew. Once the palaces were reduced to ash and the kings were wandering the deserts as beggars, the Ghost Fleet sailed back into the mist. They left behind a vacuum that allowed for the rise of something new. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, and eventually, the Romans. But this new world was built on the memory of the erasure. Every civilization that came after the Bronze Age collapse was haunted by the knowledge that the Ghost Fleet could return. To explore the origin of the Ghost Fleet, you have to first look at the massive hole in the geographical logic of the ancient world. If you look at a map of the Mediterranean in 1200 BC, every power has a center, a capital, and a clear line of logistics. The Egyptians had the Nile, the Hittites had the rugged Anatolian heartland, and the Mycenaeans had their fortified citadels. But the Sea Peoples possessed no center. They operated with a level of naval coordination that requires deep-water ports, massive repair yards, and a steady supply of specialized timber and metal. Yet, there is not a single archaeological site that serves as the home base for this fleet. This is the first great mystery that mainstream history refuses to solve. Where did they refuel? You have probably noticed that a navy without a home is not a navy, it is a ghost. The logistics of maintaining hundreds of ships and thousands of highly trained warriors across thousands of miles of ocean is a task that even modern militaries find daunting. It suggests that the Ghost Fleet did not come from the edges of the known world, but from outside it entirely. There are whispers in the ancient texts of a land beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a place where the sun sets into a vast, endless green sea. This is often dismissed as the myth of Atlantis. But if you look at the tactical capabilities of the Sea Peoples, the myth starts to look like an intelligence report. They did not just have better ships, They had a different understanding of the sea. While the Egyptians were terrified of the great green and hugged the coastline, the sea peoples moved through the deep water with the confidence of masters. They were not wandering, they were navigating. This brings us to the terrifying reality of their technology. While the empires were fighting with heavy, brittle bronze swords that required constant sharpening and often snapped in the heat of battle, the Ghost Fleet appeared with the Naui-2 sword. This was a long, tapered blade made of early steel and high-grade iron that was designed for a completely different kind of warfare. It allowed for a slashing motion that could bypass a bronze shield as if it were made of wood. You might have noticed that technological leaps usually happen slowly, through centuries of trial and error, but the Naui-2 sword appeared in the Mediterranean almost overnight. It did not evolve, it was introduced. This suggests a breakaway civilization that had been perfecting metallurgy in total isolation, waiting for the moment to deploy their superior hardware against the aging systems of the East. The absence of a paper trailoch or a clay trailoch is the most damning evidence of their origin. Every ancient people loved to brag about their victories. They built monuments, they carved stelas, and they wrote epic poems to ensure their names would live forever. But the sea peoples left nothing. No graves of their kings, no records of their laws, no inscriptions of their gods. In the world of modern intelligence, this is the hallmark of a black operation. They were a faceless force by design. They understood that to truly erase a system, you must remain outside that system. If they had stayed to build a kingdom, they would have become just another line in the history books, another empire destined to grow old and rot. By vanishing back into the mist, they remained the permanent masters of the reset. There is a disturbing theory that they were not a new people at all, but the remnants of a previous cycle of high civilization. We are taught that history is a straight line of progress, but the ruins of the Bronze Age tell a story of circles. The sea peoples may have been the custodians of a lost technological heritage, the white blood cells of a planet that had seen empires rise and fall many times before. They struck the nodes of the network that were most vital: Lokoth trade hubs, the archives, and the royal treasury Soko, because those were the places where the corruption was most concentrated. They were not interested in the gold. They were interested in the records. By burning the archives of the Hittites and the administrative centers of Greece, they performed a data wipe on the human race. You have probably noticed that the most enduring monuments of the ancient world were the ones the Ghost Fleet left untouched. They leveled the palaces of the pharaohs, but did not put a single scratch on the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was not a mistake. The sea peoples recognized the pyramids as a legacy of the founders, a technology that existed on a frequency far above the petty administrative squabbles of the Bronze Age. They were the guardians of a deeper history, and their mission was to ensure that the bloat of the current world did not obscure the foundations of the true one. The Dark Age that followed was not a period of ignorance, but a period of silence required for the next download of human knowledge. The transition from bronze to iron was not just a change in material, it was a change in the human soul. Bronze is the metal of King Soko, expensive, rare, and centralized. To make bronze, you need an international trade network to bring tin and copper together. Iron, however, is the metal of the people. It is found everywhere, but it requires a much higher level of heat and skill to master. By destroying the tin trade and seeding the knowledge of iron into the survivors of the collapse, the Ghost Fleet effectively decentralized power. They broke the monopolies of the great kings and paved the way for the rise of independent city-states and the eventual birth of democracy. They were the architects of a more resilient, more fragmented world that was harder to control through a single, centralized bureaucracy. But even as they sailed away, they left behind the markers of their presence. The sudden appearance of complex mathematics, the precision of post-collapse stonework, And the strange uniformity of the new Iron Age culture suggests that the Ghost Fleet did not just destroy, they taught. They were the schoolmasters of the shadows. The survivors were forced to innovate because the world they knew had been deleted, and the new tools they were given were designed to guide them toward a specific future. We are the products of that guided evolution. We are the children of the reset, living in a world that was built on the ashes of a global system that became too big to survive. If you look at the current state of our global network, you can see the same patterns of bloat and fragility starting to emerge. The systems are becoming too complex to manage, the interdependencies too absolute. The Ghost Fleet is not just a story from 3,000 years ago. It is a manifestation of a law that governs all civilizations. They are the glitch in the record that proves the game is rigged. They are still out there, in the gaps between our satellites and the depths of our oceans, watching as we build our new towers of glass and data. They are waiting for the moment when the circle closes once more and the system requires a fresh start. The mystery of their origin is the mystery of our own destiny. The next part of this truth involves the specific weaponization of the environment during the collapsio, how the Ghost Fleet used natural disasters as a force multiplier to break the spirit of the empires before the first ship even touched the shore. They were masters of a kind of hybrid warfare that we are only now beginning to recognize in our own era. As the ground began to shake and the rains failed, the empires looked to their gods for answers. But the only response they received was the sight of feathered prows appearing on the horizon. The end was not a disaster, it was a strategy. To understand the true scale of the Ghost Fleetoko's operation, you have to look past the fire and the steel and examine the terrifying synchronicity of their arrival. Mainstream history often points to a series of natural disasters, a century of earthquakes, and prolonged droughts as the primary reason the Bronze Age empires were already weak when the Sea People struck. But if you look at the timing through a tactical lens, a different reality emerges. The Ghost Fleet did not just happen to arrive during a period of planetary instability. They utilized the environment as a force multiplier. This was hybrid warfare thousands of years before the term was invented. They didn't just wait for the empires to fail. They coordinated their strikes with the very moment the Earth itself seemed to turn against the great kings. Imagine a world where every major seismic fault line in the Mediterranean began to trigger at once, precisely as a mysterious navy appeared on your horizon. This was not a coincidence. It was a deployment. The empires of the Bronze Age were built on the idea of permanency, massive stone citadels, and rigid social hierarchies that assumed the ground beneath them would never move. The Ghost Fleet understood that the most effective way to delete a system is to strike when its physical foundations are literally crumbling. While the priests in Hattusa were making frantic sacrifices to the storm gods to end the drought, the Ghost Fleet was seizing the last of the grain ships. They turned the natural fragility of the planet into a weapon of war. By the time the first feathered prows were spotted off the coast of Ugarit, the city was already starving and shaken by tremors. The Ghost Fleet wasn't fighting a war against soldiers. They were performing an execution on a dying patient. But this raises the most disturbing question of all. How could a barbarian force understand the seismic and climatic cycles of the planet better than the most advanced civilizations of the era? This brings us back to the mystery of their origin. If they had no land base, if they left no cities of their own, then where did they gain the knowledge to predict the collapse of an entire world? The evidence points toward a center of power that exists outside our traditional Mapsakoa civilization that did not live on the land, but with the sea. There are anomalies in the deep trenches of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean that suggest a subterranean or subaquatic infrastructure. Some speculate they were the remnants of an Atlantic empire that had retreated into the depths during a previous cataclysm, only surfacing when the next cycle of human history reached its terminal point. They were the monitors of the human experiment, watching from the dark until the system became too bloated to function. You have probably noticed that the most successful systems are the ones that remain invisible. The Ghost Fleet was the ultimate invisible system. They did not need to occupy the land because they possessed the technology to control it from the periphery. Their mastery of the Great Green, as the Egyptians called the sea, was not just about better boats. It was about a different relationship with the world. They were the custodians of a deeper history, a legacy left behind by those we can only call the founders. These were the ones who built the pyramids and the megalithic structures of the pre-Ice Age world. The Ghost Fleet recognized these structures as sacred markers, legacy code from a previous version of reality that was not to be touched. This is why the Giza Plateau remained silent and unharmed while every other administrative center in the Mediterranean was reduced to ash. The Ghost Fleet was not there to destroy the past. They were there to delete the present to save the future. This deletion was systematic and focused heavily on information. In every city they sacked, the target was the same: the royal archives. They didn't just kill the king. They burned the records of his taxes, his laws, his lineage, and his diplomatic treaties. They were executing a data wipe on the human race. By the time they were done, the survivors didn't just lose their homes, they lost their history. For 3 centuries, the Mediterranean entered a total blackout. Writing disappeared. Trade stopped. The very concept of a great king was erased from the collective memory. This was the intended result of the Ghost Fleetoko's audit. They knew that as long as the old records existed, the old rot would eventually return. They wanted a blank slate, a dark age that would function as a period of intense societal pruning. Think about the psychological impact on the survivors. You are left in a world where the massive walls of your ancestors are still standing, but you no longer have the language to read the names of the men who built them. You live in the shadow of giants, but you have been stripped of the knowledge of how they fell. This isolation was a containment strategy. The Ghost Fleet ensured that the civilization of the Bronze Age, with its endless bureaucracy and centralized Greedo not be rebuilt. Instead, they seeded the survivors with a new technology: iron. This was the ultimate pattern break. Unlike bronze, which required a global trade network for tin and copper, iron was decentralized. It could be found in almost any hillside. By giving the people the tools to be self-sufficient, the Ghost Fleet broke the back of the imperial model forever. They were the delivery system for a more fragmented, more resilient human experience. The rise of the independent city-state and the birth of early philosophy in the centuries after the collapse were only possible because the Ghost Fleet had cleared the ground. They were the schoolmasters who used the rod of total destruction to force the human race to innovate. Every piece of complex mathematics and geometry that emerged from the Dark Age feels less like a discovery and more like a recovery, a set of instructions left behind by the managers of the reset. We are still living in the shadows of that lesson. We have built our own Bronze Age of interconnected data and global supply chains, assuming that our citadels of glass are more permanent than the stone citadels of Mycenae. But the Ghost Fleet is the reminder that the game is always being monitored. Their presence in the historical Recordicode feathered prows, the long Naui 2 swords, the silence of their Deepro is a glitch that proves the reality of systemic correction. They are the white blood cells of the planet, and they only appear when the growth of human complexity becomes a cancer to the Earth's natural balance. As we look at the modern shifts in our own environment and the increasing fragility of our digital trade routes, we should ask ourselves if the feathered prows are already appearing on the edge of our own horizons. The technology of the next reset won't be iron or steel. It will be something we haven't even learned to name yet, delivered by a force that doesn't bother to leave a footprint. The Ghost Fleet didn't stay because they didn't need to. Their victory was absolute the moment the last kiln at Ugarit stopped burning. They returned to the mist, to the hidden origin beyond the pillars of Hercules or the depths of the ice, To wait for the next time the circle of history requires a closure. The mystery of who they were is less important than the reality of what they did. They proved that the most powerful empires on Earth can be deleted in a single generation by a force that understands the operating system of the world better than its occupants. The history we are taught is a comfortable lie. The history of the Ghost Fleet is the terrifying truth of our managed existence. The final phase of the Ghost Fleet Toko's operation was not marked by a grand battle or a final conquest, but by a chilling, absolute silence. You have probably noticed that the most terrifying thing about a predator is not when it roars, but when it stops making noise entirely. After the smoke cleared from the ruins of the Levantine coast, and the last administrative centers of the Mycenaeans were reduced to ash, the fleet did not occupy the territories they had won. They did not install governors, they did not collect taxes, and they did not demand tribute. Instead, they simply withdrew into the deep water, leaving behind a world that had been systematically stripped of its identity. This was the completion of the data wipe. By removing themselves from the equation, they ensured that the survivors would have no one to blame, no one to study, and no one to emulate. They left humanity in a state of total structural amnesia. This amnesia was the necessary soil for the next era of human development. In the centuries that followed, known to us as the Greek Dark Ages, the human race was forced to undergo a radical simplification. We like to believe we are the masters of our own timeline, that our progress is inevitable, and that our empires are permanent. But the silence of the Ghost Fleet tells a different story. It tells us that we are the occupants of a world that is regularly audited. The Sea Peoples were the first elite force to understand that true power is not about ruling the present, but about deciding what survives into the future. They didn't leave a name because their identity was their mission. They didn't leave a tomb because they are not yet dead. They are the silent witnesses to every rise and fall, the ones who draw the edges of our historical maps. The profound beauty of this cycle is that the reset is always a gift, even if it arrives in the form of fire. The Bronze Age collapse forced humanity to become harder, smarter, and more resilient. It stripped away the masks of the God Kings and left us standing on our own 2 feet. As the clouds gather on our own horizon and the ground begins to shift once more, we should remember that the feathered prows are not a sign of the end, but a sign of a new beginning. The Ghost Fleet is the mechanism of the world echo's renewal, the mysterious force that ensures the human spirit never becomes too comfortable in its own stagnation. We have seen the evidence of the ancient reset. The question is, do you see the signs appearing in our own world today? Tell us in the comments which modern glitch in our global systems has made you realize that history might be repeating itself. The story of the Sea Peoples remains the ultimate mystery because it is the story of the one force that ever truly won. They won by leaving. They won by vanishing. They won by ensuring that they would be remembered only as a ghost. And as we stand on the edge of our own great green, looking out at the mist and the deep water, we must face the reality that the audit is never truly over. The Ghost Fleet is still out there, sailing the gaps between our data, watching as we build our own fragile empires, waiting for the moment when the circle finally closes and the world requires its next absolute reset. History is the loop they draw, and we are the ones currently living within it, unaware that the hand holding the pen has never once wavered.